Thank you for joining today's educational webinar with Cancer Support Community Los Angeles. I'm Abby Espinoza, the Program Coordinator at CSCLA, and I'm honored to welcome you to this week's webinar titled Hereditary Cancer and Genetic Testing, What You Should Know. Before we begin, if this is your first time joining us, Cancer Support Community Los Angeles is a premier nonprofit organization providing vital social and emotional support to families facing cancer, including patients, caregivers, and their loved ones, all at no cost. Our programs include support groups, healthy lifestyle classes, social activities, and educational programs such as this one. If you would like to learn more about our services or watch past webinars, please visit our website at cancersupportla.org. Before I introduce today's speaker, please note that your video and microphone are automatically disabled for this webinar. Please enter questions for the speaker into the Q&A feature found at the bottom of the Zoom window. Questions will be answered at the end of the presentation. We may not be able to get to all your questions today, but we will get to as many as possible. Please use the chat feature to share comments and resources with other participants or to ask questions of CSCLA. We ask you to limit chat comments to information relevant to this topic. Emily Sarnoff is a certified genetic counselor specializing in cancer genetics at Cedars-Sinai Medical Center, where she has been practicing since 2023. She earned her master's degree in genetic counseling from the University of California, Irvine, and also holds a master's degree in nutrition education from American University. It gives me great pleasure to welcome today's speaker, Emily Sarnoff.
Thank you, Abby, for the introduction. Thank you all for joining me today and joining us today. I'm going to just take a moment to share my screen. We'll get through some really good info about genetic counseling, genetic testing, and then we, of course, will have time for question and answers at the end. So let's get this started here. Let's see here. Perfect. Okay. And then Abby and Kathy, are we all able to see this?
Yes, that looks good.
Great, thank you so much. So as Abby mentioned, my name is Emily Sarnoff. I am a certified genetic counselor. I work at Cedars-Sinai Medical Center. I've been practicing since 2023. And today we are going to be focusing on hereditary cancer and hereditary cancer genetic testing, and just really focusing on the basics. We'll dive a little deeper and really talk about aspects that I really think that people should be aware of when it comes to this topic. So let's start with a little genetics 101, bio 101, but let's talk a little bit more about how cancer develops. So all cancers are technically genetic. They are caused by damage to cells and genes over time. So if you look at the image on the right side of my slide, you can see here in this gray line, these are cells without damage. Over time, when someone has exposures to certain things, certain lifestyle factors, or even just the aging process, these different factors can damage cells and cause cancer to develop in different parts of the body. This damage to the cells or damage to genes are what we call mutations. These types of mutations that I'm talking about right now are called somatic mutations. It means that these mutations are unique to that specific cell or cells in your body. So we're actually not born with these, right? They're what we call acquired, meaning we get them over time. So while all cancers are technically genetic, not all cancers are hereditary. Let's talk more about hereditary cancers. So hereditary cancers are caused by mutations or problems in genes that we're born with. These are called germline mutations because they are in the genes that we are born with. Around 5 to 10% of cancers actually are hereditary. So on the flip side of things, around 90 to 95% of the time cancers are sporadic, meaning they are happening because of these acquired mutations, happen by chance, and we cannot explain. So really a smaller percentage of the time, cancers have a hereditary component, or someone is born with a mutation that is putting them at higher risk for developing certain cancers. Cancers can also be familial, meaning that there's not necessarily a big single gene change that's causing a cancer history in a family or personal history. But there might be smaller, what we call familial genetic changes that we cannot test for, or shared family environments that could be the reason why we see clustering of certain cancers in a family as well. So sometimes we'll see significant family history of breast cancer, for instance, but we're not finding a mutation. It could be because of some of these familial changes, shared family environment, or maybe a genetic mutation in a gene that has not been identified yet. The type of genetic testing that we focuses on identifying mutations in a group of genes that we're all born with called tumor suppressor genes. We actually want to have these genes and we want them to be working properly, because when they are working properly, they are doing the best that they can to protect different parts of the body from developing cancer. So if any of you have heard of the BRCA genes, or BRCA1 and BRCA2, these are examples of these tumor suppressor genes. So as a fun fact, humans have over 20,000 genes in our cells. And, genes are the instructions that our bodies need to grow and develop, but we focus on this smaller group of genes called tumor suppressor genes. Kind of going back into that biology 101, I wanted to talk about the fact that hereditary cancer risk can be inherited in two different ways. Autosomal dominant inheritance is more common. Autosomal recessive inheritance is more rare. So if you look at this top image here, this is illustrating autosomal dominant inheritance. So what this means is you really only need to have one mutation or one problem in a gene to have that cancer risk. So when we think about our genes, we have two copies of each gene. We get one from our mother, one from our father, as you can see here. So say this father here in blue has the mutation. Mom does not have the mutation. So there's a 50% chance that dad either passes the mutation to a future child, or a 50% chance that he does not pass. This is in each subsequent pregnancy. So if someone has a mutation and it's associated with this dominant inheritance, there's a 50% chance that their future offspring will, again, either have the mutation or not, and either have that cancer risk or not. So this is how mutations in the BRCA genes function, the Lynch syndrome genes function, and really the majority of the genes that we talk about with hereditary cancer risk are inherited in this fashion. There are some genes that are associated with recessive inheritance, meaning that someone has to have two mutations in the gene to have the cancer risk, meaning they would need to inherit one mutation from their mother and one mutation from their father. So this certainly is a bit more rare. There is a gene that you can see listed here. It's called MUTYH, associated polyposis. It is a long name, but essentially this is a recessive colon cancer or colon polyp condition that does have some risk with other types of cancers as well. So let's talk a little bit more about when is genetic testing recommended. So the National Comprehensive Cancer Network, also known as NCCN, sets forth guidelines that help direct recommendations for individuals who should have genetic testing. Several insurance companies follow these NCCN guidelines for testing coverage, but some insurance companies also have their own genetic testing or coverage criteria, which we'll talk more about later on in the presentation. So as you can see on this slide, these are just some examples of scenarios when genetic testing is recommended, but there are many, many different scenarios, which is why working with a genetic counselor, a genetics provider, or another provider who works with genetics, this can be really beneficial to speak with these people because they can assess whether, is testing recommended or not. So I broke it down into three main buckets of when genetic testing is recommended. The top one is, of course, when someone has a current diagnosis, a new diagnosis, or a personal history of certain cancers. So for instance, an individual who has a diagnosis or a history of ovarian or pancreatic cancer, we absolutely recommend genetic testing for these individuals because these cancers are more often hereditary. So if you think back before, I said most of the time cancers are hereditary around 5 to 10% of the time. We say ovarian cancer is hereditary about 20% of the time, and pancreas cancer hovering around 10% or a little bit higher. So on that upper end of that interval. Other scenarios where we recommend testing for individuals with a personal history or recent diagnosis of cancer would be breast cancer, colon or uterine cancer diagnosed before the age of 50. With breast cancer, it's either 50 or younger. Sometimes people hear, oh, if it's younger than 50 with breast cancer, it's recommended, but 50 and older, it's not. That's not the case. 50 is still technically considered earlier onset. Family history of cancer, certainly scenarios with someone who has a first or second degree relative, meaning a parent or an aunt with a history of ovarian cancer, having a parent or a sibling with pancreatic cancer. And then there are some other more nuanced scenarios, like having a mother, for instance, who was diagnosed with breast cancer before the age of 50, having a first degree relative diagnosed with colon or uterine cancer before the age of 50. And then I even included, again, an even more nuanced scenario of having more than 3 close relatives on the same side of the family with breast and or prostate cancer. So this is just a small list of these scenarios where testing is recommended. At the bottom, I have this third bucket, those with limited family history. So for individuals who are adopted or just don't have information regarding their family medical history, those individuals can also consider genetic testing for hereditary cancer risk, given that, we don't have information about their family. There could be cancers in their family that we're unaware of. However, anyone can undergo genetic testing. So this is an option for anyone if you want to move forward with it. You don't have to, quote unquote, meet criteria. What I will say too, when it comes to family histories of certain cancers that are more often sporadic, like lung cancers, are typically not included in these scenarios of when testing should be recommended. But if you're sitting here saying, I don't fit into any of these scenarios, like I mentioned, anyone can consider genetic testing. There are scenarios too where we find mutations on people's genetic testing when they actually don't meet criteria. So it certainly happens. So let's talk a little bit more about how genetic test results can impact medical care. There are 3 different types of results when we are doing genetic testing. Again, as a reminder, we are looking at tumor suppressor genes. The goal of the testing is to see, are there any problems in these genes or mutations, or are these genes working as expected? So the first result that we can see is called a positive result. This means that a mutation in one of these genes was detected. This absolutely, as you can imagine, does impact medical care and management for the individual who has the mutation. It also has implications for family members. The risks and recommendations that we give for an individual depend on which gene has the problem. So if the gene is associated with an increased risk of breast and ovarian cancer, we make recommendations about that. If the mutation has to do with increased risk of melanoma, we make recommendations for more skin screening. If someone is found to have a mutation, all of that person's first degree relatives, meaning their parents and their siblings and their children, have a 50% chance of having the same mutation. So this is why, of course, family testing is so important if we identify a mutation in someone, because we want to make sure that we are testing individuals and getting them the proper screening that they need if they also test positive. So on this slide, I know it's pretty wordy, but as an example, I wanted to include the BRCA1 gene. This says BRCA2 risks for males, but we'll say it's BRCA1. So the BRCA1 gene, or BRCA1, BRCA stands for breast cancer. This particular tumor suppressor gene is associated with risk of breast cancer, ovarian cancer, pancreas cancer, and then even male breast cancer and prostate cancer. So if you look at both columns, there are implications for both men and women, which I think this is a really good example to show why both men and women should undergo genetic testing. I think that it's a common misconception, especially for genes relating to breast cancer, that men don't need to test. But as you can see by these tables, this is not the case. For women, if they are positive for a BRCA1 mutation, we recommend earlier breast screening starting at the age of 25 with breast MRIs. Then at 30, we add in both breast MRI and annual mammogram with the consideration of doing risk-reducing surgery. We do recommend removal of ovaries and fallopian tubes between ages of 35 and 40 for these individuals. And we might possibly recommend pancreatic screening. These recommendations can change based on someone's family history. If we see an extremely early onset breast cancer in a family, we may start this a little bit sooner or start clinical encounters sooner. And then I also just wanted to highlight recommendations for men who have BRCA1 mutations. We do recommend that they begin clinical breast exams at 35. We might recommend mammograms for these individuals. If there's a history of male breast cancer, we recommend earlier prostate cancer screening. And then, like I mentioned before, possibly talking about pancreatic screening. So as you can see, these have implications for anyone who tests positive, which is why it's important for everybody to test if it's something that's indicated based on their history. On this slide, I just wanted to highlight risks for different genes. I think the BRCA genes are spoken about a lot, so I just wanted to talk about other genes and how having mutations in these genes can impact risk. I won't go through this entire list just because it's pretty long, but there is a gene called MLH1, for instance, for individuals who have mutations in this gene. They have a diagnosis of what we call Lynch syndrome. There's actually 5 different genes that are associated with the diagnosis of Lynch syndrome, and they are named after the physician that discovered them. As you can see here, for both men and women who test positive for mutations in Lynch syndrome, they are at increased risk of several different types of cancers, the number one being a high risk of colon cancer over the lifetime. So in this scenario, we recommend colonoscopies starting sooner and happening more frequently. For women, we would talk about endometrial cancer and ovarian cancer risk reduction strategies, and then other types of cancer screenings like urinalysis for risk of bladder ureter cancers, things like that. And then I also wanted to highlight another gene called PALB2, which is associated with breast and ovarian cancer, pancreas cancer as well. And there is some preliminary evidence that says the PALB2 gene may be associated with risk of prostate cancer for men. But of course, there are many other genes associated with many types of cancer risks. And if someone has a mutation associated with a certain cancer, the goal is to screen someone to make sure that we either catch something in an early stage when it's easiest to treat or prevent something from happening altogether. Let's talk about the other types of results we can see. Negative result means that we didn't find any mutations. This is good news. That means we are not going to make any changes to someone's medical management based on a negative result, and therefore screening recommendations are then based on someone's personal or family history. For instance, if someone has a significant family history of breast cancer, but they tested negative and there's no known mutation in the family, depending on how old that person is, we would recommend running a breast cancer risk model, such as the IBIS or Tyrer-Cuzick model that could determine, does this person qualify for increased breast screening at a certain age? So not only annual mammograms, but adding in this annual breast MRI. Another result we can see, it's called a variant of uncertain significance, or we call it a VUS. These are nothing to worry about. These results just mean that a lab found a change in a gene, but they just don't have enough data to know, is this a harmful change or is this just a benign change? About 90% of the time, they are reclassified, or what we call downgraded, to benign or likely benign. all of our genes are different. So it's pretty expected that we find some differences in our genes that don't affect the way the genes work. Similar to a negative result, again, we do not recommend changes to someone's medical care based on having an uncertain result. Recommendations are based on personal or family history. This is very important because, like I said before, about 90% of the time, an uncertain result gets reclassified to negative or likely negative. If say someone or a female has an uncertain result in the BRCA2 gene, and if we were to make recommendations for that person, like you should have your ovaries and fallopian tubes removed, and they undergo that surgery based on an uncertain result, and then 2 years down the line, the lab comes to us and says, hey, actually that BRCA2 uncertain result is actually nothing, then someone has made a really big decision that maybe they didn't have to make. So that's why we don't recommend changes to medical care based on an uncertain. What I also wanted to touch on too is if someone has a diagnosis or personal history of cancer and they test positive, meaning they have a mutation, that may explain why they developed the cancer that they developed, and it could certainly have implications for their medical management. For instance, if a female has breast cancer and she tests positive for a mutation in a gene associated with breast cancer, she might want to have a conversation with her breast surgeon about doing more involved surgery. While we're talking about result types, I wanted to bring up this concept of the uninformative negative. So this is what we call a pedigree. It's a family tree. So when we look at this, individuals, the circles are females, squares are males. If you see a line with the line at the end of it, that means that individual does not have children. We can see individuals in the family who have cancer or cancer history. That's identified by the shading in the circle or square. And then a line through an individual means that they have passed. So this person with the little arrow pointing next to them, this person is our proband, meaning they are the person presenting to us for genetic testing. So say this person here comes to us, does genetic testing, results come back completely negative, normal. This is great news, but this is really only good news for this person and then their children. The reason being is that this person's father, who has a diagnosis of pancreatic cancer, may have a mutation associated with his pancreatic cancer that this person did not inherit, right? Because if dad has a mutation, there's this 50% chance he's either passing it to his offspring or he's not. So in this case, if our patient here tests negative, I would absolutely still recommend genetic testing for siblings and other members in the family. However, the most informative people in this family to test would be this patient's father, who has the pancreatic cancer diagnosis, and his maternal aunt, who has who had a history of early onset kidney cancer. So really the most informative individuals in a family to do genetic testing are the people who have either a diagnosis of cancer or a personal history of cancer, because they are more likely to have the mutation. So if this patient came to me, he was completely negative, my first recommendation would say, are we able to have your father tested, and are we able to have your maternal aunt tested? Is this something that they're up for doing? If in this scenario, this patient said, no, my father is unable to test, so my aunt is also unable to test, then I would certainly recommend genetic testing for this patient's sisters and even other paternal and maternal relatives to make sure that we're not missing something in a family. I bring this up too because it's very common. I hear a lot of the time, oh, well, if my genetic testing is negative, is that good news for my siblings? And while it's certainly good news, the reason, of course, why I say it's good news, but your siblings still need to test is because, again, you and your full siblings only share 50% of your DNA. So I just think it's a common question that people have. I wanted to also talk about genetic testing panels. Genetic testing has really evolved over time. We've certainly come a long way from the BRCA 1 and 2 testing in the late 90s to the early 2000s. Classically, those were the genes that really were only to be tested in this time period. And now things have changed. Now we can assess more genes. Some genetic tests can assess over 150 different genes associated with cancer risk, depending on the laboratory. We not only can look at DNA now, but we can also look at something called RNA. These two, DNA and RNA together, make up that final protein product of the gene. So we can do a little bit more testing than previously we're able to do. In fact, one lab that we work with quotes that the inclusion of RNA analysis now yields a new mutation about 1 in 50 times. So it's not a lot, but it's also not zero. So we really recommend updated genetic testing for those who have had previously limited testing. So if you have had the BRCA testing in 2009 or 2010, I would certainly recommend that you consider updated genetic testing that includes other genes relating to other cancer risk, and also includes this RNA concept. There are many different types of panels that someone can choose from. Again, it's really up to the person who's undergoing genetic testing what they want to look for. We can do panels that look at genes relating to more common cancers in the population. So things like breast, ovarian, colon, uterine cancer, stomach, and pancreas cancer. Or if someone wants to look at more genes, we certainly can do that. We can do more expanded, what we call multi-cancer panels that include the genes relating to common hereditary cancers, but also include genes relating to more rare cancers that maybe we're not seeing in that person's family. And then, as I mentioned before, we can certainly do custom panels. If someone says, I just want to focus on breast cancer and colon cancer genes, we can certainly build a test to focus on what that person wants to do. And we can really tailor a genetic test to someone's personal and family history. Sometimes maybe any of you have heard of what we call single site or single gene testing. This means that someone is having testing that only looks at one gene or is assessing for a known familial mutation that, again, exists in a family. So it's certainly an option for individuals with these known familial mutations. But actually, recent data suggests that about 3% of patients with one mutation actually have two mutations. So it's possible to miss a second mutation in a family if we're only doing single site testing. Again, this is why it's certainly beneficial to chat with a genetics provider to kind of walk through options. This is just another case for expanded panel testing. Like I mentioned before, there are many other tumor suppressors genes that exist aside from BRCA1 and BRCA2. Using this family history as an example, again, you can see this female here with the little arrow. She has a very significant family history of cancer on both sides of her family, but there are different types of cancers. So when I look at this patient's family history, on her paternal side of the family, this pattern of prostate and breast cancer makes me more suspicious for mutations in the BRCA genes. But when I look at this patient's maternal family history, I'm seeing colon, ovarian, and uterine cancer. I'm certainly suspicious for a possible mutation in the Lynch syndrome genes. So if this particular patient only had testing for the BRCA1 and 2 genes, they could miss a mutation coming from mom's side of the family in the Lynch syndrome genes. So this is a very simple example, but just wanted to explain why considering larger testing, especially when someone has a family history of many different types of cancers, can certainly be beneficial. I wanted to walk through the genetic testing process with everyone just to kind of break down what actually happens when someone wants to undergo genetic testing. So there's really 5 steps. I wanted to really simplify it. Step 1 would be either meet with a genetic counselor or a provider who orders genetic testing. They would review your personal history and family history, and then you would decide on which genetic testing panel do you want to move forward with. Then next steps are usually a blood draw. Most of the time, genetic tests involve a blood draw. It's usually 2 tubes of blood, but you don't have to be fasting. What I will say is a blood sample, we can do DNA and RNA testing on blood, and the failure rate of a blood sample is less, meaning that there's a higher chance of success for the testing on blood. If someone prefers to not undergo a blood draw, we can also do sample through saliva or cheek swab. This only looks at DNA, does not include the RNA, but both sample types are great, right? I think that's another common question that we get sometimes, as well as blood, better DNA than saliva? And the answer is no, they're both equally as good, but there's some nuances to the different sample types. If someone is doing a saliva sample, for instance, we also recommend that they don't eat or drink 20 or 30 minutes before submitting the saliva sample. Results timing, results take usually around 2 to 3 weeks to result. When results come back, you would be contacted by the person who ordered your testing. And then, of course, if there is a mutation, would recommend following up with that provider to make sure that you are undergoing screening that's necessary, and also knowing the most up-to-date protocol for that mutation. Again, if someone's negative, there still might be recommendations that are given based on personal history of cancer, or sorry, family history of cancer. Cost of genetic testing, I think, is a really important topic to bring up. The cost of genetic testing really depends on what insurance someone has. So some insurance companies follow those NCCN guidelines I briefly mentioned before for test coverage. Some insurance companies also have their own guidelines for test coverage. A genetic counselor or other genetics provider can certainly help determine if you meet criteria for insurance coverage for genetic testing. If someone does not have health insurance, they can certainly still undergo genetic testing, as some laboratories also offer a self-pay option, generally for about $250. I believe it's $249 to be exact. Typically a mobile blood draw, or what we call mobile phlebotomy, is actually included in that cost as well. So the $250 would cover the testing, and it would also cover the blood draw. And when it comes to coverage for testing, we can still look at as many genes as we want. That doesn't affect the cost of testing. Another important thing to note is that most health insurance plans only cover this type of testing once. So say if you have had genetic testing, 15 years ago, and you have, you're interested in undergoing testing now, if you have the same policy as you did 15 years ago, they may not cover testing again. So just something to keep in mind. And while we're on the topic of insurance, I wanted to bring up insurance protections. There is a law in the United States called GINA, the Genetic Information Non-Discrimination Act, that came to be in 2008, 2009. What this law says is that so it prohibits health insurance and employment discrimination based on someone's genetic test results. Genetic information not only includes personal genetic test results, but it also includes information about family medical history, which I think is really interesting. So basically, if someone has a mutation, their regular health insurance cannot be affected. They can't be dropped from their coverage. Their premiums cannot be raised. If they were to switch health insurance companies, this information, they can't use it against you. When it comes to employment, if someone works for a company that employs 15 people or more, this information can also not affect employment. So on the flip side, this law does not apply to employers who have less than 15 employees, and it also does not apply to the U.S. military. So, if someone is found to have a mutation and they are in the military, this could affect their status. The law also does not apply to different types of policies like life insurance, long-term care insurance, or disability insurance policies. If someone already has these policies in place, then they are completely protected. It's only if someone were to either expand coverage or apply for a new policy that it could affect this. Some people also ask us, well, are you guys sharing this information with life insurance companies? And the answer is no. Sometimes when an individual is applying for something like life insurance, they will be asked about personal medical history. Sometimes that includes, have you had genetic testing? So finally, how do we get genetic testing? You know, we've talked about so much information about genetics and genetic testing, but of course, I think the most important thing is we talk about how does someone do this? So if it is something that you're interested in doing, absolutely ask your medical provider, your primary care provider about genetic testing options or for a referral to a genetic counselor. If you have a PPO insurance, you can always be a self-referral. If you have an HMO insurance, you would need authorization from, for instance, a primary care provider for referral, or you would need a referral for genetic counseling. You can also use this link, this findageneticcounselor.nsgc.org link to help find a genetic counselor in your area. This is a great link for people in different states. You can send the link to family members and they can find telehealth options or in-person options as well. One of the most important points to remember though is if, say, your family member has a mutation, make sure if you can to bring their test report to your appointment or send the test report to your provider ahead of time because it really helps us be able to see, you know, what are we looking at in this family, and it actually helps the labs look to make sure that either that person has the mutation or they don't. Okay. And here are some references, and thank you everyone for your time. I have provided my email address, and then I have provided the scheduling phone number for Cedars-Sinai Cancer Genetics if anyone is interested in giving us a call and scheduling an appointment. I can also put that information in the chat as well. I'm just going to start from the top down. I think it's better to do it that way instead of previously kind of jumping through during the presentation. The first question is, may I ask for what reasons breast cancer or other cancers for that matter are greater chance for those of Ashkenazi Jewish ancestry? I think this is a really fantastic question. So in the Ashkenazi Jewish population, there are what we call founder mutations in certain genes that are unique to this group of people. So for instance, the BRCA genes, there are 3 founder mutations between these genes that are more commonly seen in individuals of Ashkenazi Jewish ancestry. For instance, the general sort of population risk to have a mutation between the BRCA1 and 2 genes is about 1 in 400. The chance to have one of the founder mutations in BRCA1 and 2 is, if someone is of Ashkenazi Jewish ancestry, is about 1 in 40. So it is a significantly higher chance. There are some other founder mutations, for instance, in a gene called APC. But there are many different founder mutations that are present in many different groups of individuals. But specifically, that's why you know, we ask about Ashkenazi Jewish ancestry, since it's more common to have one of those BRCA founder mutations. The second question is, what are the current limitations of genetic testing? And if you could please differentiate the kind of genetic testing you're referring to. Yep, with respect to raw data sets, one attains from 23andMe that they got done in 2014. I love this question. I think this also comes up a lot. So really the main difference between the type of testing that we do and the type of testing that 23andMe does is the type of testing that we do is really clinical genetic testing. So the main difference is that we are looking at more genes than 23andMe looks at. We are looking at more of the gene. We do sequencing, we look for deletions, we look for duplications in the genes, where 23andMe only looks for specific mutations that they have identified that they want to look at. So say they look for maybe only 100 mutations in the BRCA genes, for instance, but the testing that we do, we're able to look at almost 100% of the gene. When it comes to finding a mutation on 23andMe, so if someone has a BRCA mutation that's identified, we recommend that they come to us for clinical testing to confirm that they do have the mutation. When it comes to the raw data sets, this certainly can be beneficial. If you download your data and input it into one of these programs and it comes up that someone has a mutation, say relating to hereditary cancer risk, even maybe in a different gene, I certainly would still recommend bringing that raw data to someone like a genetic counselor so we can do confirmatory testing. It's a great question. I think it comes up quite often. The third question here is, once one has their genetic test results, when risks are deemed moderate to really high, what role does changing diet, lifestyle, other factors play in affecting the expression of the genes? Also a great question. I think it's really important to remember that if someone is found to have a mutation, generally speaking, there are a few mutations that are associated with a 100% chance risk of cancer. But most of the time, these mutations are a risk factor, right? We're not diagnosing someone with a cancer based on a mutation. And usually it's not a 100% chance guarantee that someone develops a cancer to begin with. So I think, to your point, modifying things like diet, lifestyle, and other factors can certainly, potentially reduce the risk of that cancer developing. So I think there's all of this interplay, in addition to, making sure that you are keeping up with the screening recommendations so something isn't missed. So I think that it certainly is relevant to focus on diet and lifestyle, of course, if someone is found to have a mutation, because it could certainly play a role. Let's see, sort of a similar question. Yeah, if one repeats same genetic test after many years, living healthy lifestyle, would one expect to see lowered risks of the same genes deemed higher risk prior? So sort of the same good question. It's a good question. So when we think of our genes, right, our genes aren't changing. Our DNA, for instance, stays the same. So if someone was found to have a mutation in the BRCA1 gene 10 years ago and we retest them now, theoretically, we'd find the same mutation, and the percentage risks that we would give to that person would be similar. So unfortunately, we can't really identify how much someone is lowering their risk if they are making all of these lifestyle changes, for instance. So it's more of a sort of an abstract thought, right? We can't say, all right, well, your breast cancer risk was 70% because of your BRCA mutation, but now it's 40% because, you have made these lifestyle modifications. So unfortunately, we're not able to quantify that. But in theory, right, making those changes can sometimes certainly be beneficial. Great question. ATM runs through my family a lot. Why don't we hear about this when other genes are mentioned? I think this is a really good question. I think that people just don't have the information. I think some of these genes get more publicity, for lack of a better word, right? Like the BRCA genes have been talked about forever. But I also think that they come up a lot is because we've known about them for a really long time. ATM, we haven't known about as long. And same thing with some of these other mutations. And I think that it's certainly really important to talk about these because, again, people are sometimes having really limited genetic testing and maybe they do have an ATM mutation, but the ATM gene wasn't tested. So I'm hoping that over time, and the more genetics is talked about, and the more education that happens, people will start to learn that there are other genes instead of, just these couple of genes that are more commonly talked about. Okay, let's see here. Let's see, another really good question here. Does it typically take a couple of years for a variant of uncertain significance to be clarified? Yes, absolutely. Sometimes it can take 1 year. Sometimes it can take 5 years. But, generally speaking, the goal for the labs and for us, right, is to have these uncertain results be reclassified. We don't want these just kind of floating around and having these big question marks. So it really just is time dependent. But for individuals who do have uncertain results, we say that, they are more than welcome to contact us, once a year or once every 2 years. They can check in with us. We can check in with a laboratory and see, has this been reclassified? But again, generally speaking, they do inform us when they make that change. Sometimes it can just take a little while. Another really good question, if one's living well, then started to live stressful life, or kind of, bad diet, exercise, would genetic testing show no mutations a decade or two earlier, or possibly show up with mutation identified on the same test? So same thing, our genes don't change, our mutations that someone has or something that they're born with. So unfortunately, diet, lifestyle, exercise, for instance, can't change the fact that someone has a mutation. It's something that's in every cell in their body. It's also one of those things, we can't control the genes we inherit from our parents. We can't control the genes that we pass down to children. So we can't really reverse it at this point, with these types of factors. There are certainly research going on about gene editing and things like that. That's, I think quite a ways off and certainly out of my scope, but I think that it's a really fascinating topic. Another question. Are there different types, breadth, and depth of genetic testing? Could you please go into cost ranges one can expect? Yep. So touched on it a little bit before. There are many different types of genetic testing for hereditary cancer risk. Again, it's really up to you how much information you want to learn. If you said, I want to learn as much as possible, depending on the lab that you're having testing from, someone could have a test that looks at 170 different genes relating to cancer risk, or 40 genes if you wanted to focus on more common cancers. So generally speaking, cost, it really sometimes does depend on the laboratory. They have different billing policies. One lab quotes that their, PPO patients pay around $100 or less. But again, generally speaking, if someone meets the NCCN criteria or the insurance company's coverage criteria, they're not usually getting a bill. Sometimes certain labs have policies where if someone's testing through insurance is going to cost a lot of money, they might be able to be switched to a self-pay option of $250. So there's definitely a lot of flexibility with cost, and these labs do have patient financial assistance programs as well. Okay, let's see. Another question. I have genetic issue called, severe, hyperhomocystinemia. And inhibiting proper DNA methylation regulation activity greatly increases chance of many kinds of cancers. What type of testing would be most appropriate for someone like me to test every year to monitor? So the hyperhomocystinuria and methylation testing, it's not something that we necessarily do. But I would, if you would like to, you can certainly email me at my email address, and I'd be happy to give you some resources of where you might be able to obtain different types of testing. But I would say overall, making sure that you're at least doing recommended age-related cancer screening. So, following up with colonoscopy screening, prostate screening, mammograms, depending on what type of screening is necessary, I would at least recommend those. Let's see, how has the field of genetic counseling evolved in functions and overall services and information provided in a session? I think the field has evolved a lot. Again, it's pretty evident by just the amount of genes that we can look at and how the testing technology has evolved. So, I would say personally, I think that our sessions are very informative. We cover a lot of information. We talk about hypotheticals. We really use the family history as a tool to assess for the likelihood of a mutation. Again, we use different genes as examples of how this testing or how these results could impact medical care. So we really go through a full informed consent process and really answer as many questions for people before testing and then certainly after testing. So again, I think that the field has evolved and is certainly continuing to evolve. And then a question about autoimmune conditions correlating to cancers and genetic testing. When it comes to autoimmune conditions and testing, unfortunately, more research needs to be done in that area. As far as I know, there really aren't any single gene tests that can be done to test for mutations associated with autoimmune conditions. But with that, kind of similar as before, recommending continuing those age-related cancer screenings, speaking to your rheumatologist, and I'm hoping that in the future we'll be able to do some genetic testing for risk for autoimmune conditions. Great question about education. Do all genetic counselors go through the same education for their areas of specialization, certificates? So we do go through, I would say at least similar education. Genetic counseling programs certainly differ in their curriculum, but we all learn the same things. So an individual who is a genetic counselor does go to typically a 2-year master's program, and then we do have to take a board certification test to be licensed in the United States to practice. License requirements do differ by state. There are some states that actually don't require licensure. California is not one of those states. California does require genetic counselors to be licensed to practice. But again, states, there's maybe 4 of them. I think Vermont is one of them actually, where they don't require a genetic counselor to have a license. They just need to be board eligible, meaning that they've gone through a master's program in genetics or genetic counseling, and they can technically sit for the test, but they don't have to. When it comes to further areas of specialization, we also are required to do continuing education units, a certain amount every 5 years to recertify. So we really are constantly learning and keeping up to date, attending conferences, and really sharing information with each other. Let's see, what's up and coming in the world of genetic testing and counseling? Other AI developments bringing certain additions or evaluations sooner rather than later? I think this is a great question. I personally, at this point, don't know of, really how AI will impact what we do. I do know that some clinics, for instance, are changing up their model where they might have what they call a chatbot who, speaks to patients ahead of time and gives them sort of the lowdown and the rundown on what testing can do for them, does that pre-test counseling without the person, and then the genetic counselor delivers results on the back end. So some clinics are maybe moving in that direction to help with volume and have more patients seen faster, just because I know that that's certainly, an issue with certain clinics, is that the wait times can be a lot. And then let's see, with insurance protections, all the medical records getting hacked at faster rate. I have a concern my genetic test results can get out there. This is my block to considering genetic testing. Anyone can do in the face of cybersecurity. I think it's a really important thing to consider. When we do genetic testing, for instance, the labs that we use are HIPAA compliant. Their goal is to protect that information as best as they can, but like you said, there's always this risk of, that information getting out there or someone hacking that information. I would say, as far as my knowledge with these really big companies, to me personally, it's not as big of a concern. But of course, with some of these like public companies, direct to consumer genetic testing, that might be more of a risk. But again, there is that federal and insurance protection law. So completely understand. I'm happy to talk more about it. But of course, I'm not necessarily a cybersecurity expert either. But hoping that, those protections, assist in the situation of some sort of like hack situation. This is a really good question. If someone gets a transfusion, blood or anything else, can it change their genetic markers? So technically, yes. So if someone, for instance, has had a stem cell transplant from someone that is not themselves, so sometimes they can do stem cell transplants with your own cells. If someone gets a stem cell transplant from someone else, say a family member or somebody else, that actually does affect your genetic test results if you draw blood. That's because the blood test is going to be picking up on the mutations of the donor. So in that case, we do recommend actually what we call a skin punch biopsy instead. It's usually done like the upper arm or the upper leg, where they just remove a small piece of skin and then they're able to take the DNA out of the skin and actually do the testing that way. That way we know we're testing your DNA. Also, similarly, if someone has an active leukemia or lymphoma, this is also a scenario where we recommend that skin punch, because we would be picking up abnormal mutations because of that blood cancer. So if that is something that you have personally gone through, I would recommend talking with a genetic counselor or genetics provider before going through with testing, just to make sure you're getting the right sample type. And then let's see about findageneticcounselor.com or .org directory. That's really the main one that we use. So I really would direct anyone to the findagc.nsgc.org link. If you have any questions, or if, again, you have trouble finding a genetic counselor or genetics provider, definitely reach out to me and I'm happy to help assist. And then similar question when sort of with the 23andMe of it all, right? Do these genealogy, ancestry, health reports, are they accurate? So it's not that they're incorrect. So usually if, an ancestry.com or a 23andMe identifies a mutation in one of these genes, it's generally correct, but we do recommend confirmatory testing for these findings. And another good question about, is genetic testing different for bodies still in development? The answer is no, because our genes stay the same throughout our lifetime, at least the ones that we're born with. But when it comes to how old someone should be when we do genetic testing, typically we recommend that someone waits until they're around 18 or older, just to wait until that person is of adult decision-making age. Of course, there can be scenarios where we do recommend genetic testing for younger children if a mutation has impacts for medical management as a child. For instance, certain type of thyroid cancer, when someone is 4 years old, we want to test them as soon as possible. We might actually do a preventative thyroidectomy, for instance. Again, these are very, very rare. Most of these mutations don't affect childhood medical care. Another thing I wanted to just touch on was this question: to clarify, results are not protected from insurance companies. So correct, but only life insurance, long-term care insurance, and certain disability insurance policies, regular run-of-the-mill health insurance, that is protected. So like Blue Cross, a Cigna, a UHC, those are protected. And then Abby, I know it's a little after 2. I can run through a couple more of these if you want.
Yeah, we can go over a few minutes. If you want to answer a few more, you can.
Perfect. Great. I see a good question about the MSH6 gene. It says higher risk of colon and uterine cancer. Great question. So for those wondering, MSH6 is a Lynch syndrome gene. We talked about MLH1 before. MSH6 is another one. For people who have mutations in the MSH6 gene, you are correct. There is an increased risk of colon and uterine cancer. At this point, there is no evidence to say there is a correlation with Lynch syndrome and breast cancer. So for someone who has a Lynch syndrome mutation, like a mutation in MSH6, we would recommend screening based on family history. So if you have a significant family history of breast cancer, we would want to run, one of those breast cancer risk models, see if, that person qualifies for increased screening based on that family history. But the research is always changing. The NCCN is always updating guidelines, always giving us new information, which is great. One other question I really wanted to touch on was this question about the difference between molecular testing on tumors and then this type of genetic testing. I get this question a lot. So testing on a tumor is looking at mutations that are unique to the tumor. This is different than the genes that we're born with. So the tumor mutations are called those somatic mutations, those acquired mutations. And then the ones we test in all the cells we're born with, those are the germline mutations. Sometimes tumor testing can indicate a genetic mutation that someone was born with, if it's seen at a higher percentage. We call it a variant allele fraction, or VAF. So sometimes tumor testing can actually indicate the need for the type of genetic testing that we do. But generally speaking, the tumor testing can help with, tumor profiling, treatment options, and things like that. Whereas looking at the genes we're born with sometimes can help with treatment or management options like the BRCA genes and a PARP inhibitor, for instance. But generally speaking, doing the germline genetic testing is also really helpful to see, is someone at risk for other cancers? Do we have a genetic reason for these cancers? And do other family members need to test? Let's see here. How often do errors happen with genetic testing? So I will say that no test is 100% perfect. But I would say the testing is, 99.9999% accurate. We're, typically not getting false positives. So if we find a mutation on someone's genetic testing, they have the mutation. Again, unless they have a blood cancer that we don't know about and we're getting some kind of funky results because of the blood cancer. But typically the results are very accurate. In the world of false negatives, it's not that we're getting a false negative because the test is wrong. It's just that maybe there's a mutation we haven't identified yet or a gene we haven't discovered yet. I think lastly, a really good question about, being scared and how do you mentally prepare for something like undergoing genetic testing. It's certainly it's a big deal. If someone has a mutation, it certainly has implications for their medical care. And that's why I also think speaking with a genetic counselor is a really good idea, because we not only talk through testing options, but we are a resource to help support people throughout the testing process. And I do think that something that can be helpful for people is, taking some time and think, okay, well, what would my life look like if I were positive? How would that change? Like, how would that make me feel? Would it really impact my day to day? Would I not be able to function? Things like that. And just kind of really think about that aspect, right? How your life would change if you had a mutation. But those are things that we also talk about in genetic counseling sessions. So it's not just the clinical aspect, but we do walk through possibilities and kind of touch on that sort of more like emotional, mental aspect of it as well. But there's so many good questions. I feel like we could be here all day.
Thank you so much, Emily. We truly appreciate you being here with us today and sharing all of your expertise. Yeah, we're just really grateful to have you here.
Listen, I'm always happy to come back to. But I can put if I type in the chat, Abby, will it go to everybody?
Yes. So you can put your contact info in the chat.
Just gonna
And then,
oh yeah, go ahead.
yeah. And then we just have one final closing slide, Kathy, if you want to go ahead and share that. Again, thank you to all of our participants for being so engaged today and for all your thoughtful questions. But if you'd like to learn more about Cancer Support Community Los Angeles, please visit our website at cancersupportla.org. And if you have any questions or would like a copy of the slides, Emily has graciously agreed to share a copy. So if you would like to request a copy of the slides, please feel free to email us at info@cancersupportla.org. We also wanted to share one of our healthy lifestyle classes that we offer every Sunday. It meets every Sunday. It is our Reiki Healing Experience class. Meets Sundays from 9 to 9:45. And if you're interested in registering or want to take a look at all of our offerings, you can go ahead and scan the QR code and it'll take you to our calendar where you can see everything that we offer. But once again, I want to thank Emily and I want to thank all of our participants for being here with us. We really, truly appreciate you being here, Emily, and we hope to see you all at a future webinar. Thank you so much, everyone.